There is a story the world has been told about Rwanda. It goes something like this. Two ancient tribal groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi, hated each other for centuries. In 1994, that hatred finally exploded, and nearly 1 million people died. This story sounds clean and self-contained. However, it is not entirely true. The truth is more disturbing, and in many ways, more important. You see, the Rwandan Genocide was built, piece by piece, over nearly 100 years, by colonizers who needed an enemy, by politicians who needed a scapegoat, and by propagandists who needed an audience. To understand what happened in Rwanda in April 1994, we need to go back to the beginning, to everything that came before. Long before any European ever set foot on the hills of Rwanda, the land was already home to three groups of people: the Twa, the Hutu, and the Tutsi. The Twa were the first forest-dwelling hunter-gatherers who had lived in the region since at least 8000 BC, centuries before anyone else arrived. They were a small community, never more than roughly 1% of the population, and they occupied a position in Rwandan society that was marginal and often overlooked. Between 700 BC and 1500 AD, Bantu agricultural communities began migrating into the region, clearing the forests and farming the rich volcanic soil. These were the people who would later be known as the Hutus. Later still, pastoralist groups from the Nile Valley and the Ethiopian highlands arrived, bringing cattle. These were the Tutsis. But here is the crucial thing that so much of the world got wrong and continues to get wrong. The distinction between Hutu and Tutsi was not entirely ethnic or racial. It was primarily socio-economic. As the historian and journalist Gérard Prunier explains,
what separated a Hutu from a Tutsi in pre-colonial Rwanda was largely a matter of cattle. Own enough cows, and you were Tutsi. Lose them, and you could become Hutu.
All three groups, Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa, spoke the same language, Kinyarwanda. They shared the same territory, the same culture, the same religion, and often the same family networks. They were collectively known as the Banyarwanda, the people of Rwanda. By the 19th century, Rwanda had organized itself into a powerful, centralized kingdom, ruled by a Tutsi monarchy under the institution of the Mwami, or king. The greatest of these kings was Kigeli Rwabugiri, who reigned from 1853 to 1895. Rwabugiri was a conqueror and an administrator. He expanded the kingdom westward and northward, absorbing new territories and peoples into his realm. But his expansion came at a cost. To consolidate power, Rwabugiri expanded two already existing labor systems that would have enormous consequences. The first was Ubuhake, a cattle clientage system in which a Tutsi patron would grant cattle to a Hutu or Tutsi client in exchange for loyalty, tribute, and service. This system existed across Rwanda, binding ordinary people to their social superiors in networks of obligation. The second, and more oppressive, was Uburetwa, a forced labor system tied specifically to the Hutu, who were required to work without pay on land that had been seized from them. Under Uburetwa, Hutu farmers had to perform unpaid service in exchange for the right to stay on the land they had farmed for generations. Unlike Ubuhake, which involved some measure of mutual obligation, Uburetwa was nakedly exploitative. It created real and lasting resentment among the Hutu population. But even these systems, as harsh as they were, did not create the rigid, biological ethnic divide that would later drive the genocide. That idea had yet to arrive. It would come from Europe. In 1884, the Berlin Conference carved up the African continent among European powers like the portions of a dinner. Rwanda and its neighbor, Burundi, were subsequently assigned to the German Empire. Germany established its first formal presence in Rwanda in 1897, building an alliance with the Rwandan royal court. The Germans chose a strategy of indirect rule, governing through the existing hierarchy, propping up the Mwami and the Tutsi chiefs rather than dismantling the local system. However, the Germans brought with them the racial theories that were fashionable in European scientific and intellectual circles at the time. When they looked at Rwanda and saw a powerful monarchy with a distinctive-looking ruling class, the Tutsi, who tended to be taller and thinner than the Hutu, with facial features that European observers found more Semitic or Ethiopian, they immediately reached for their racial toolkit. The explanation they produced was called the Hamitic hypothesis. The theory claimed that the Tutsis were the descendants of Ham, a biblical figure cursed by Noah, who had migrated south from Ethiopia or the Nile Valley, bringing with them a higher civilization. They were, in short, a superior race, closer to Caucasians than to true Bantus, and therefore naturally suited to rule. The Hutu, by contrast, were classified as racially inferior, indigenous, primitive Bantu agriculturalists who were, by nature, destined to be governed. The Hamitic hypothesis took what had been a political and socio-economic hierarchy and recast it as a biological and racial one. Subsequently, Germany's colonial rule was cut short by the end of the First World War. Belgium, which had already controlled the neighboring Congo, took over Rwanda in 1916 and formalized the arrangement through the League of Nations in 1919. However, the Belgians inherited the German colonial apparatus and the Hamitic hypothesis along with it. The Belgian colonial project in Rwanda was one of the most systematically destructive acts of social engineering in modern African history. And it was carried out, as such things often are, in the name of order, efficiency, and civilization. They worked closely with the Catholic Church, which had established a powerful presence in Rwanda from the 1900s onward. The church and the colonial state together redesigned Rwanda's political structure, eliminating the checks and balances within the existing system, including the role of Hutu land chiefs, who had historically served as a counterweight to the Tutsi cattle chiefs, and replacing everything with a streamlined hierarchy in which Tutsi authority was total and Hutu subservience was absolute. In 1933, the Belgian colonial administration did something that would have consequences no one could have fully anticipated. They issued mandatory identity cards to every Rwandan, classifying each person as Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa. The classification system was initially crude. Anyone who owned 10 or more cattle was listed as Tutsi. Anyone with fewer was Hutu. But the crude physical anthropometry of the day was also used. Officials measured nose width, face shape, and height to assign racial identities to people who had never thought of themselves in those terms. Overnight, the identity card became the most important document in a person's life. And 60 years later, it became the instrument of their death. Beyond the identity cards, the Belgians systematically concentrated political and economic power in the hands of the Tutsis. In 1943, Belgium eliminated local chieftaincies that had been held by Hutu and replaced them with Tutsi chiefs appointed directly by the king. Tutsis were given priority in mission schools, which were the only path to education and upward mobility. Consequently, by the late 1940s, the Tutsis had a near monopoly on education and administrative positions. The Hutu, some 84% of the population, were effectively locked out of public life and confined to agricultural labor. The result was a new social reality that bore little resemblance to the one that had existed before colonialism. After the Second World War, anti-colonial movements began to rise across Africa and Asia. Within Rwanda, something had been quietly building among the Hutus, a sense of injustice that had accumulated over decades of enforced inferiority, unpaid labor, and systematic exclusion. In 1957, a group of Hutu intellectuals issued a document called the Bahutu Manifesto. It was a straightforward declaration. The Hutu were being oppressed and demanded political and social equality. The Catholic Church, which had for decades been the ideological pillar of Tutsi supremacy, sensed which way history was moving and switched sides. It began supporting Hutu political movements with the same institutional zeal it had once used to entrench Tutsi power. With church support, the Hutu politician Gregoire Kayibanda, a former seminarian, founded the political party Parmehutu, the party for the emancipation of the Hutu people. The machinery of ethnic politics was now fully assembled. On the evening of November 1st, 1959, a Hutu sub-chief by the name of Dominique Mbonyumutwa was attacked near his home in Gitarama by supporters of a pro-Tutsi party. He survived, but that was enough. Within hours, Hutu activists began attacking Tutsis across the country. What followed became known as the Social Revolution, or the Hutu Revolution, a series of killings, burn-ins, and upheavals that drove Tutsi from political power and physically expelled thousands from their homes. The Belgians, who had once supported the Tutsi without reservation, now began to show favour towards the staunchly Catholic and anti-communist Hutu elite. As a result, the Belgians replaced most Tutsi chiefs with Hutu, consigned the Tutsi king, Kigeli V, to a figurehead status, and organised elections that returned an overwhelming Hutu majority. A Hutu republic was declared in 1961, and in 1962, Rwanda became independent under Gregoire Kayibanda. The hierarchy had now been flipped, but the architecture of ethnic division was never dismantled. The Belgians, who had spent decades constructing a racial caste system, now left, and left behind a country with no capacity to disassemble what they had built. As the revolution progressed and intensified, Tutsis fled by the hundreds of thousands. They crossed into Uganda, Burundi, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. By 1964, more than 300,000 Tutsi had left Rwanda and were forced to remain in exile for the next 3 decades. Those who stayed faced periodic massacres and systemic discrimination. When armed Tutsi exile groups launched attacks into Rwanda from across the border, each attack was met with reprisal killings of Tutsi civilians still inside the country. Kayibanda governed for roughly 12 years, periodically allowing anti-Tutsi violence to spike whenever his political position weakened. However, in 1973, he was overthrown in a military coup by his own defense minister, a northerner by the name of Juvenal Habyarimana. Juvenal Habyarimana came to power with the promise of unity. In 1975, he founded the National Revolutionary Movement for Democracy and Development, known by its French acronym, the MRND. Subsequently, in 1978, after a controlled referendum, he formalized Rwanda as a one-party state, effectively making every single Rwandan citizen a member of the MRND. In the early years of his rule, there was relative peace. Anti-Tutsi violence decreased significantly. Economic conditions improved modestly. Some historians have noted that Habyarimana was, at this stage, genuinely attempting to govern all Rwandans. even if Tutsis were systematically excluded from senior positions in the army and government. However, the single most important structural feature of Habyarimana's Rwanda was a circle of people around him that Rwandans called the Akazu, which translates roughly as little house. The Akazu was centered on Habyarimana's wife, Agathe Kanziga, and her family from Gisenyi. They were ultra-nationalist Hutu extremists, deeply connected to the military and the security apparatus, and they harbored an ideological commitment to Tutsi extermination that was not metaphorical. In fact, the people who would ultimately plan and execute the genocide came from the Akazu. They were inside the president's house, sharing his table for 20 years. By the late 1980s, things were deteriorating rapidly. A global collapse in coffee prices hit Rwanda's agriculture-based economy hard. An IMF structural adjustment program demanded austerity measures that left the population poorer. Furthermore, a terrible drought struck parts of the country. The sense of crisis and resentment that had been building since independence began to find new outlets. And then, in October 1990, everything changed. In the 1980s, a group of Rwandan Tutsi exiles in Uganda found a home in the rebel National Resistance Army, led by Yoweri Museveni. They had fought in Uganda's Bush War, helping Museveni come to power in 1986. Their leader was Fred Ruigema, a brilliant military commander who had risen to become one of Uganda's most senior military officers. Around him, he had assembled a core of battle-hardened Rwandan exiles who had spent their whole lives in diaspora, haunted by stories of a homeland they had never seen or could barely remember. They called themselves the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF. And on October 1st, 1990, Ruigema led more than 4,000 fighters across the Ugandan border into Rwanda. Unfortunately, 3 days later, Fred Ruigema was dead, killed in combat under unclear circumstances. His deputy, a young military tactician by the name of Paul Kagame, was training in the United States at the time. He flew back immediately and took command of the RPF. Following this, the RPF invasion failed militarily. The Tutsi exiles were pushed back by the Rwandan army, supported by French and Zairian troops that Habyarimana had hastily summoned. However, politically, the invasion was a gift to Habyarimana, and more importantly, to the Akazu.
The president and his close colleagues decided to exaggerate the RPF threat as a way to pull dissident Hutu back to his side. And they began portraying Tutsi inside Rwanda as RPF collaborators.
The invasion was used to justify the arrest of tens of thousands of Tutsi civilians inside Rwanda on suspicion of collaboration with the RPF. Furthermore, between October 1990 and January 1993, Habyarimana's hardline allies carried out a series of localized massacres of Tutsis. In January 1991, Tutsis in the Bugogwe region, part of Habyarimana's own clan homeland, were massacred, with estimates ranging from several hundred to over 1,000 dead. In 1992 and early 1993, extremists carried out killings in Bugesera that left more than 300 dead, after a false broadcast on Radio Rwanda warned that local Tutsi were planning to kill Hutu. Importantly, each massacre went unpunished. Each one simply told the extremists that there would be no consequences. Rwanda's path to mass murder was paved by a propaganda machine that was as sophisticated as it was vile. And it was built almost entirely in the years between 1990 and 1994. The first instrument was a magazine called Kangura, meaning Wake Them Up in Kinyarwanda. It was founded in May 1990 by a journalist named Hassan Ngeze. Ngeze was also a member of the Coalition for the Defense of the Republic, the CDR, an extremist Hutu power party that was even more radical than Habyarimana's own MRND. His magazine was financed by senior officials linked to the Akazu. Kangura was anything but subtle in its reporting. It was designed to generate fear, rage, and racial hatred in its readers, and it was extraordinarily effective. Its most infamous publication, known as the Hutu 10 Commandments, came in December 1990, 2 months after the RPF invasion. Written as a deliberate parody of the biblical commandments, it laid out an explicit ideology of ethnic war. The first commandment declared that any Hutu man who married a Tutsi woman was a traitor. The 8th commandment instructed that Hutus must stop having mercy on the Tutsis. Overall, these commandments explicitly merged all Tutsi civilians with the RPF enemy, declaring them to be spies and collaborators by virtue of their ethnicity alone. They also went as far as introducing the dehumanizing term inyenzi, meaning cockroaches, to describe the Tutsi people. The limitations of Kangura were clear. It was a printed magazine, and literacy restricted how far its message could spread. To reach a much wider audience, the extremists needed a medium that could instantly enter homes, markets, streets, and villages. They needed a radio, and in 1993, they built it. Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, the RTLM, the Free Radio and Television of 1,000 Hills, launched its broadcasts in July 1993. It was founded by a prominent businessman by the name of Félicien Kabuga, a Rwandan historian and intellectual, Ferdinand Nahimana, and Jean Bosco Bariyagwiza, a senior politician and founding member of the CDR party. The RTLM was deliberately designed to appeal to young Rwandans. Its broadcasters spoke in casual, conversational Kinyarwanda rather than formal French. Only 1.52% of its total airtime was devoted to news. More than 66% consisted of broadcasters just talking, commenting, and laughing. It was entertainment, and woven through all of it, seamlessly and constantly, was poison. Leading up to the genocide, researchers have counted over 200 RTLM broadcasts that explicitly called for the Hutus to kill the Tutsis. RTLM's role was so central to the killing that Rwandans nicknamed it Radio Machete. While the media was building the ideology, the military was building the killing force. Beginning in 1990, the Rwandan Armed Forces, the FAR, expanded dramatically, growing from fewer than 10,000 troops to nearly 30,000 in a single year. These new recruits were often poorly disciplined and poorly paid, but they were armed. And alongside the regular military, a new structure was quietly taking shape. The Interahamwe, a Kinyarwanda word meaning those who attack together or those who stand together, were the youth militia attached to Habyarimana's ruling MRND party. By early 1992, Habyarimana had begun providing military training to the MRND's youth wing, transforming it into the first of what would become the killing squads. Similarly, a parallel militia, the Impuza Mugambi, those who have the same goal, was attached to the extremist CDR party. Together, these militias were primarily recruited from displaced Hutus who had been driven from their homes in the north by RPF fighting. By the eve of the genocide, their combined membership was estimated at 50,000. The army trained these militias, sometimes in conjunction with French military advisors who, according to various records, were unaware of their true purpose. Rwanda also began importing weapons at a scale that had no plausible civilian explanation. The country, one of the poorest in the world, with virtually no manufacturing base, imported hundreds of thousands of machetes in the years before 1994, far beyond any agricultural need. In a 1992 arms deal, Egypt sold Rwanda a large consignment of weapons facilitated by Boutros Ghali, then Egypt's foreign minister, and later the United Nations Secretary General. In the 3 years from October 1990, Rwanda, one of the poorest countries in the world, became the third largest importer of weapons in Africa, spending an estimated $112 million. In 1993 alone, the hardliners imported machetes, along with razor blades, saws, and scissors, and quietly distributed them across the country as part of the so-called Civil Defense Network. Later that year, Hutu power operatives had begun compiling lists of traitors, moderate Hutu politicians, Tutsi community leaders, journalists, clergy, and anyone else who might oppose or survive the coming storm. The Kangura newspaper even ran an article implying that Habyarimana himself would be targeted if he continued cooperating with the peace process. Just as the extremists were consolidating their plans, a political earthquake struck from the neighboring country of Burundi that handed them an extraordinary propaganda gift. In June 1993, Burundi elected its first ever Hutu president, Melchior Ndadaye, a democracy activist who represented an astonishing breakthrough in a country with its own history of ethnic violence. Unfortunately, on October 21, 1993, a group of extremist Tutsi army officers assassinated Ndadaye. Consequently, the shock that rippled through Rwanda was immediate and profound. In Burundi itself, the assassination sparked a civil war in which 50,000 to 100,000 people died in the first year alone. In Rwanda, the Hutu power propagandists seized on the murder as proof of everything they had been saying. The message was brutally simple: the Tutsis cannot be trusted. The only choice, the RTLM and Kangura screamed day after day, was to act first. The idea of a deliberate and systematic genocide, which had first been suggested in 1992 but had remained a fringe viewpoint, was now top of their agenda. The plan was in place. All that was needed was a trigger. Against all of this, the international community was attempting to broker peace. Negotiations between the RPF and the Rwandan government had been ongoing since mid-1992 in the Tanzanian city of Arusha. On August 4, 1993, after more than a year of negotiations, the Arusha Accords were finally signed. The agreement called for an immediate ceasefire and an established framework for a broad-based transitional government that would include the RPF. It was, on paper, a genuine foundation for peace. But almost everything about the Arusha process had made the extremists more dangerous. You see, during the Arusha Accords, the negotiators for the Rwandan government were disproportionately drawn from MRND liberals and from the opposition parties who had entered into a coalition with the MRND. In part because Habyarimana wanted to distance himself from the process. Furthermore, The CDR, the most radical Hutu extremist party, had been excluded from the talks entirely. To the Akazu, the Arusha Accords were not a peace agreement. If implemented, the accords would bring RPF forces into the capital, share power with the Tutsis, and potentially expose those who had ordered the massacres of the past 3 years to accountability. After the accords had been signed, the United Nations sent a peacekeeping force, the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, the UNAMIR, commanded by a Canadian general by the name of Romeo Dallaire. He arrived in October 1993 with 2,500 troops with a mandate to oversee the Accords' implementation. They had no idea what they were walking into. On January 11, 1994, General Romeo Dallaire sent an urgent coded message to the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations in New York. This message will later be known as the Genocide Facts. In it, he described a meeting with an informant he called Jean-Pierre, later identified as Kassim Turatsinze, a chauffeur to the MRND party chair who had been working as a senior trainer for the Interahamwe. What Jean-Pierre told Dallaire was staggering. The Interahamwe were registering all Tutsis in Kigali, not for electoral roles or administrative purposes, but for targeting. Jean-Pierre told Dallaire that in 20 minutes, his men could kill up to 1,000 Tutsis. He revealed the locations of hidden weapons caches distributed around the city. He said that the extremists were planning to trigger the genocide by killing Belgian peacekeepers, knowing that Belgium, which had recently lost soldiers in Somalia, would withdraw its troops rather than absorb further losses, crippling the UNAMIR. In a 2003 interview with the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Jean-Pierre's wife, Genevieve, recalls what her husband had told her.
Whilst in Kigali, my late husband got involved in politics, particularly the MRND party, although I am not exactly sure which year this was. As days went by, my late husband told me that there were divisions within the MRND and that the party was going to break up into two. My late husband did not come from either of the two warring parties, and according to what he told me, the party was planning to commit some massacres of people. He further told me that if he remained with the MRND, it would mean that he would start by killing his mother and me. Because I am Tutsi and his mother was Tutsi, I understood this to mean that the massacres were going to be against the Tutsi population. As a result of this, my husband wrote a letter of resignation from the party. I think that this was either at the end of 1993 or the beginning of 1994.
Following this, Dallaire asked for permission to raid the weapons caches and to protect his informant. He was denied. His superior in New York, General Barrel, replied that UNAMIR's mandate did not allow for such action. The fax was also transmitted to the governments of Belgium, France, and the United States, but nothing happened. By early April 1994, Rwanda was a country in the advanced stages of a hidden emergency. The Interahamwe were armed and trained. The death lists were finalized. RTLM was broadcasting its poison 24 hours a day. The weapons, machetes, grenades, AK-47s, had been distributed across every prefecture. In addition to this, the full implementation of the Arusha Accords had been greatly delayed. By April 1994, more than 7 months had passed since it was signed, and nothing significant had changed. Meanwhile, the hardliners around Habyarimana, the men of the Akazu, men like Tioneste Bagosora and Augustin Bizimungu, were finalizing the last details. And on April 6, 1994, the moment finally came.